Hi, folks. Welcome back. Here we go. Okay. So I just introduced you to Chicago-style Dixieland, and the subtle little differences between that and New Orleans style. And really, it's more about how the music is evolving as Chicago style makes more room for individual solo space. That's kind of the direction that music will eventually go. Um, and we'll see that back and forth during the swing era. Some bands won't improvise very much, or some bands will improvise a lot. But what will happen sort of after the swing era is the music is dominated predominantly by great soloists, and it becomes a soloist art form. And that can go all the way back to sort of this evolutionary change from New Orleans style to Chicago style. Okay, so speaking of great improvisers, we need to talk about Louis Armstrong. And again, we're going to take this out of context because he's such a big figure. We need to talk about. I like to do it all in one giant thing, one giant lump. So I've uploaded a whole bunch of Louis Armstrong tunes for you. It's just a tiny sliver of his recorded works, but they're going to be from different eras, and they're going to kind of show what he was really good at. I hope both trumpet playing, and singing, and other sorts of things like that. Okay. So you're also going to watch a few videos about Louis Armstrong. I think those Ken Burns clips do a really great job of painting sort of the right picture, particularly early on in the early jazz era. These are really helpful. All right. So as you can see, and if you haven't already figured this out, Louis Armstrong was a trumpet player from New Orleans, arguably the first great jazz artist and one of the most influential artists of all time in American musical history. A lot of people don't remember back this far, but Louis Armstrong did such innovative things that actually changed the musical language entirely. Music before Louis Armstrong was pretty different than music after Louis Armstrong. He was that big of a figure. Okay. So first great soloist. He redefined the rhythmic conception to include swing eighth notes, the degree of swing, do ba da bo dee, the amount of unevenness of the beat. Louis Armstrong swang harder than everybody else, and wherever he went, he taught people how to swing. So when he was working with King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band in Chicago, they had this really great swinging thing going on. When he left and he went to New York City to join Fletcher Henderson's group, Fletcher Henderson's group was full of outstanding players, but none of them had the right concept of swing. So Louis Armstrong basically taught everybody in New York how to swing. And then he was heard on all these recordings that would be spread around the country. And so anyone that would hear Louis Armstrong play the trumpet sort of got the style and the essence and the degree with which he would swing. And that's how it kind of spread like wildfire. Okay. Absolute master of the trumpet. Every once in a while, there's somebody who is multiple steps ahead of everybody else. And then it takes a long time for everybody to catch up to that person. If we use the same analogy for sports, you could argue back in my day, it was Michael Jordan was the best basketball player, hands down, multiple times over, right? And so it took a while, but then eventually everybody kind of catches up to that skill level. And then the bar is raised and everybody kind of meets that bar. And then somebody else will come along, like perhaps LeBron James or something will come along, and he will set a new bar that everybody has to chase, right? That's just kind of how it is. Musically, the same thing. When Louis Armstrong came along and was at his peak, he was multiple, generations essentially ahead of everybody else. So then everybody during the 1920s, when they started to hear Louis Armstrong on recording, they're racing to kind of catch up with Louis Armstrong. And then you get, 10, 15 years later, you get this influx of great trumpet players who all grew up on Louis Armstrong records. And now they can do everything Louis could do. And now they're setting the bar even higher. We'll talk about Dizzy Gillespie in particular when we get to that point. Who's the next guy who would set the bar, at least as a physical, what he could do on a trumpet, on a demanding instrument like a trumpet, he sets the bar even higher. So this happens on all instruments and sort of all walks of life. Louis Armstrong was the first really new innovative person there. Okay, he popularized that New Orleans trumpet style, and then again extended it and spread it across the country. He recorded a tremendous amount, and again, people took that. They would learn how to play like Louis Armstrong, and then they would develop into their own musicians using that repertoire of Louis Armstrong licks, that kind of stuff. He was an outstanding singer, and really was a great interpreter of songs, and taught a lot of people how to sing. We'll talk about other jazz singers who sort of learned from Louis Armstrong how to interpret a song and how to sing. Billie Holiday in particular. There were a lot of pop singers who were big fans of Louis Armstrong. Bing Crosby, when people asked Bing Crosby, who's your favorite singer, he would always say Louis Armstrong. So Louis Armstrong was monumentally important. And there's some debate on this, but he was one of the first, if not the first person to introduce scat singing on record. And scat singing is using your voice to improvise like you would on an instrument. So as a trumpet player, you pick notes that are going to work with chords, and you try to make sense out of it. You do the same thing with your voice in this case, but you can't think of words typically at the same time, so you sing gibberish. Skadooba-dee-ba-doo-ba-da, skoodala-ba-ba-boo-boo-ba, like that kind of stuff. That's scat singing. It's how vocalists improvise. It's the easiest way for them to improvise like a horn player, basically. Okay, Louis Armstrong was one of the first people to do that on record, and since his record sold so well, that sort of introduced the concept of scat singing to everybody else. Okay, all right. So some basics here. Born in New Orleans, August 4th, 1901. Died in Queens, New York, just shy of what would have been his 70th birthday, July 6th, so a month shy. He was married 4 times. There's lots of books on Louis Armstrong. If you're interested, there's a great one called Pops that came out, within the last maybe 10 years, which is really well written, and it tells his life story really, really well. He was married 4 times. His first wife was an ex-prostitute in New Orleans named Daisy. His second wife was Lil. He met her in Chicago playing with King Oliver. His third wife was Alpha. People know less about her. She was kind of a private person. And then his last wife was Lucille. He had a lot of nicknames. Dipper Mouth or Satchel Mouth, and Satchel Mouth was shortened to Satch Mo, and that is basically just because he had a really big mouth. He had a big jaw, and people, whoever gave him the nickname, likened his mouth to like a dipper or a satchel you would dip in a jug of water and drink from. So that's how he got the name. And then he also got the name Pops because he would call everybody Pops. Hey, Pops, how you doing, Pops? Right? And so it kind of came back, and people started calling him Pops, and it worked because he was the elder statesman, of jazz for a very long time. Okay, so if you haven't already seen the video clip, you're going to get a lot of this when you do. If you have, some of this is just reinforcing what you've already seen. Okay, he performed around New Orleans as a young man after being released from the colored waifs home. That is essentially juvenile detention for black children. Oops, I guess that was right. Black children in New Orleans at that time, in the first decade of the 20th century. And again, he was mentored by people like King Oliver and things like that. He was hired to play on a steamboat that moved up and down the Mississippi River. I talked about how Bix Beiderbecke heard him play in Davenport, Iowa. The name of the boat was the SS Sydney in the summer of 1919, and the group was called the Jazzy Sazzers. In 1922, August 8th, that's when he traveled to Chicago to join King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. The rest is history, right? With King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, starting in 1922, this was, again, in Chicago. I'm trying to give you locations and some important information. He made his first recording ever with King Oliver for Gannett Records in Richmond, Indiana. That record was called Chimes Blues. And they recorded 37 sides in 1923 alone. That's pretty substantial. It kind of goes to show you how popular jazz was at this time. It was very new, very exciting, very fresh. I have uploaded Dipper Mouth Blues for you from our previous discussion about New Orleans versus Chicago-style Dixieland. That's our example of Chicago-style Dixieland. Louis Armstrong does not have a featured role in this tune. It's King Oliver, Joe Oliver, that does, but he's playing on that record. Okay. 2 years later, Louis Armstrong moves to New York. He gets sort of pilfered away from Joe Oliver and goes to New York and becomes the star of the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra. Fletcher Henderson, you'll hear about again, was sort of like an early society musician, and he became an early big band leader. Before big bands really took over during the swing era, Fletcher Henderson sort of had a band that was almost a big band right before the big band era. He was like right on the cusp of it, basically. This was in New York. He said, quote, that Louis Armstrong made his band, quote, really swing conscious with that New Orleans style of his. Again, that's the degree of swing and how he had to teach all the New York musicians how to play that way. There's a bunch of great tunes they recorded together, Shanghai Shuffle, Sugarfoot Stomp, and what have you. I uploaded Shanghai Shuffle for you. It has a long extended trumpet solo in there, and it's played with Fletcher Henderson's orchestra at that time. So by all means, go listen to that particular tune. This is before the invention of the microphone, so it doesn't sound great, but you definitely get a feel for the swing feel and how much space Louis Armstrong would get as an improviser. Okay, so pause this video now, go listen to Shanghai Shuffle, and then come back for some more Louis Armstrong. Go. Okay, I hope you enjoyed it. In addition to performing with Fletcher Henderson in New York was one of the main epicenters of the music business, music publishing, and music recording. So Louis Armstrong got to record with a number of blues singers like Bessie Smith. I uploaded, as an example, the tune Lost Your Head Blues, which is Bessie Smith singing and Louis Armstrong playing improvising trumpet and responding to her. There'll be a line sung by Bessie Smith, and then Louis Armstrong improvises sort of a reply to her, and then she sings a line again, and he improvises a little reply to her. So these records, if you didn't buy Fletcher Henderson albums or King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band records, but you did buy Bessie Smith albums, you're still listening to Louis Armstrong, and you're listening to him improvise. So by all means, please go check out Bessie Smith's Lost Your Head Blues, and then come back for more. Go. Okay, here's where it starts to get even more interesting. So Louis Armstrong had married Lil Armstrong, who was in King Oliver's band, and as he got more and more famous, Lil decided to sort of capitalize on this, and she said, "You got to come back to Chicago, and we'll start a group." And that group was actually called Madame Lil Armstrong's Dreamland Syncopators, featuring Louis Armstrong, the world's greatest cornet player. That would not fit on the marquee very well. So later on, I think they just sort of evolved into what's known as the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens. So Louis Armstrong recorded dozens of albums, dozens of records, not full records, but I'm talking songs here, under the title Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five, or Louis Armstrong and his Hot Seven. And this would be from transplanted musicians from New Orleans that he had played with, years ago, like himself, Lil Armstrong, obviously on piano, Johnny Dodds, Kid Ory, Johnny St. Cyr, lots of other people like that. They recorded both in Chicago and New York, and the complete works of the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens have actually been reissued multiple times. If you're into this music, you can certainly go and get them. I uploaded the tune Hotter Than That, again, previously as an example of Chicago-style Dixieland. So please go back and check that one out again. And under the context of this sort of changing, evolving Louis Armstrong growing as a soloist, in a sense. All right, so go check that one out again and then come back. Go. Okay, you're going to see in a video clip how Louis Armstrong was used in the entertainment industry in the 1920s, and he was a big draw. He was a widely popular star, and he actually played on Black Broadway, and particularly in a show called Hot Chocolates, which is barely veiled sort of innuendo there. He was in that show, and he sang songs. He didn't just play them on his horn, but he also sang some songs. The tune "Ain't Misbehavin'" and the tune "Black and Blue." These became very, very popular songs. In fact, he was asked to sing them multiple times during the production. I have uploaded the version of "Black and Blue" for you. It's a great song about a man. When you think of black and blue, you think of like bruises or that kind of thing. This is about being blue in the context of being sad because you're black in a white society, basically. It's a wonderful song. So once again, pause and go listen to Black and Blue, and then come back. Go. Okay. Next step, right? So we've gone from New Orleans to moves to Chicago, New Orleans and riverboats and that kind of stuff, moves to Chicago, plays with King Oliver, moves to New York, plays with Fletcher Henderson, starts to record, starts his own band, the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens, right? Back to New York, on Broadway, all this kind of stuff. Eventually, he starts his own big band called Louis Armstrong and his New Sebastian Cotton Club Orchestra. This was in California. This is 1929, and big bands are about to become the next big thing. We're right on the cusp of the big band era. So Armstrong and his management decided, let's start a big band. And they did. It wasn't the most well-known big band in the world. There will be much more popular big bands soon. But it was another vehicle for Louis Armstrong. And he recorded, again, multiple great tunes like Shine or Dinah, or one of my personal favorites, Just a Gigolo, which had been covered by many other artists, including actually David Lee Roth after he left Van Halen in 1985 or 1986. He recorded and released a version of Just a Gigolo. But I'm not sharing that one with you. You can go check that out if you want to. I did give you the Louis Armstrong version. It's kind of a melancholy, sad. He's just, sad song, understanding sort of his place in the world. It's a great tune. So again, go pause this clip, go listen to Just a Gigolo, and then come back for a few more things on Louis Armstrong. Go. All right. Now I've also uploaded 2 short film clips. The first is one of his earliest appearances in film. Louis Armstrong was a big star, arguably one of the biggest African-American stars at the time. There's only a handful of people on his level who were black in America in the late 20s, 30s. Duke Ellington would be one of them, and we'll talk about him later, but otherwise not very many. So he got the opportunity to be in films a fair amount. In 1932, he starred in a short film called A Rhapsody in Black and Blue, where he performs the song Shine. I believe this is with his New Sebastian Cotton Club Orchestra. He performs the tune Shine, and this tune that I absolutely love called I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You, which is a song about he's singing to a friend who's been trying to basically steal his wife or steal his woman away from him. And it's full of, you have to listen to it from the context of 1932, and there's some language in there that is not necessarily appropriate anymore, or some caricatures in a sense, like when you're laying 6 feet deep, no more fried chicken will you eat, stuff like that. But it's just a great song. One thing I want you to see or pay really close attention to when you see it, I provided a link to the entire movie. It's about 12 minutes. It opens with a husband and wife sort of thing, and she's supposed to be cleaning the house, and she gets mad at him and knocks him unconscious with a mop. When he's unconscious, he dreams that he's the king of Jazztopia or something like that, Jazzland, and that's when Louis Armstrong and his group is playing. But what I want you to pay attention to, other than the great music, is that the way Louis Armstrong would ham it up, kind of. He was very much an entertainer, and he felt it was his responsibility for everybody to leave the show smiling and happy. So there's a lot of, kind of over the top, um, uh, hamming it up, basically. Um, Again, Louis Armstrong grew up in the segregated world. Most of his entire adult life was in a segregated world. Um, he was an entertainer, and he was always playing for white audiences, and it's just kind of how he was programmed. I bring this up because the generation after the swing era, in particular, doesn't think that way anymore. And and we're going to talk about it at that time, and that's coming up right in through the 50s, through the buildup of all the civil rights. Um, um, uh, Legislation is about to be passed, and there's all of this turmoil in the South. There's the church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. There's the murder of Medgar Evers and civil rights workers. And there's something called the Freedom Riders, which were people who were trying to desegregate buses and all this stuff. It was dangerous, and it was a chilling time in the country. And at that point, black musicians were going out of their way to not be like a Louis Armstrong figure. In fact, a lot of them derided Louis Armstrong for being that sort of entertainer, that old-fashioned entertainer. But you'll see it in A Rhapsody in Black and Blue. So go check that one out. And then I want you to compare it with the other example I gave you. I have these links here, which you don't need. In 1936, he was in Pennies from Heaven. But in 1956, he was in High Society with Bing Crosby. There's a couple of things to compare and contrast here. Obviously, they're kind of doing different things. It's different eras. But in 1932, look at what Louis Armstrong and the group is wearing, and how they are painted. It's very sort of primitive. They're wearing like leopard print togas, and it's jungly and all that kind of stuff. It's very ethnic. They make jazz appear as something foreign and kind of dangerous, fun, but not of this soil sort of thing. Whereas in 1956, he's with the group called the Louis Armstrong All Stars, and they're all in tuxedos, and they're very highly respected sort of musicians. It's really quite fascinating. So go pause this, go check out both of those clips, and then come back for a little bit of a wrap up here on the Louis Armstrong. Go. Okay. So during the swing era, which was, the 30s and World War II era. So generally it's 1935 to 1945, but of course there's some gray area there because they're not concrete dates. But during the swing era, Louis Armstrong's popularity and innovations were sort of surpassed by other musicians, other bands, both black and white, and jazz became the most popular sort of music of the country at that time. Louis Armstrong, so he kind of fell by the wayside and continued to do his things and continued to make a living, and he did pretty well during the Great Depression. But he wasn't the big star anymore. Other people had rose to the occasion. Well, in 1947, he appeared in a concert that wasn't even publicized tremendously, at a venue in New York called the Town Hall, which was sort of like an old-fashioned Dixieland thing. It was how it used to be in Chicago, or how it used to be in New Orleans. It was Louis Armstrong on cornet, and there was a clarinet player and a trombone player. So just like a Dixieland band, there was a rhythm section. So you had a front line and a rhythm section. And this would be slightly different because Louis Armstrong, being so well known, and in addition to being a great trumpet player, also being a singer. So there'd be, they'd play Dixieland versions of songs that he could sing and all this kind of stuff. But it was very much sort of an older fashioned jazz event right after the swing era, right? It turns out it was wildly popular, even without being promoted heavily. There was a huge audience for it. They loved it. So they took this group on the road. And this is the group that Louis Armstrong toured with for the last 20 years of his life, just on the road, almost always with his all-stars. The group would change. People would come and go, but it was always Louis Armstrong, and it was always billed as the Louis Armstrong All-Stars. Which also, I should point out, in 1947, at first, it was an integrated group. And actually, in fact, it almost always was. There was almost always one or two white members in this 5 or 6 piece group, which is a pretty big deal at this time, because we are not yet desegregated as a society, right? So there were certain parts of the country that perhaps Louis Armstrong and his All-Stars couldn't play because they weren't accepting of that or progressive enough to be at that point yet. Okay, it is with the All-Stars that Louis Armstrong has some of his late career great hits. Like he recorded the well-known tune "Mac the Knife" in 1955, that became a hit song. In 1964, he recorded the theme song to the musical Hello, Dolly. It was a Broadway musical, and the theme song was Hello, Dolly. Louis Armstrong recorded a version of it with the All-Stars. So it's a Dixieland band. I've actually uploaded their version onto Moodle, and I want you to go check it out. Louis singing, playing some trumpet. There's a clarinet. There's a muted trombone. It's a Dixieland band. They overdubbed a couple of other things, but generally it's a Dixieland band. In 1964, at the height of Beatlemania, Louis Armstrong, who at this point would have been a 63-year-old black old jazz trumpet player, actually knocked the Beatles out of #1 on the Billboard popular charts. To give you an idea, I have my Billboard book right here. The 3 #1 hits before this song, before Hello, Dolly reached #1, were all Beatles songs. I Want to Hold Your Hand was #1 in February of 1964. That was followed up by She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah in March of 1964. Can't Buy Me Love in April of 64. And then Hello, Dolly in May. So that's just an incredible factoid at the height of Beatlemania, too. This is not 1967 Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band or some of the more experimental Beatles stuff. This is right when the Beatles arrived, played the Ed Sullivan Show, and exploded into the United States. And as you can see, had 3 consecutive #1 hits. And here comes this old washed-up jazz musician that knocks him out of #1. It's fascinating. I uploaded Hello, Dolly. Go check it out. It's a great tune. And I didn't upload all these tunes. You can check them out, and you probably know some of them already. There was also the tune What a Wonderful World, which just about everybody's heard Louis Armstrong sing. Now, these aren't necessarily jazz tunes. They're pop songs. Even though they're presented in sort of a jazz style, What a Wonderful World isn't. It's much more of a pop treatment. But Hello, Dolly is presented with the All-Stars in a jazz-ish style. Mac the Knife is presented sort of in a jazzy style. But they're not really jazz tunes. They're pop tunes. Louis Armstrong, in addition to being a great jazz musician, was also a great pop singer. All right? So go check out Hello, Dolly. Think of how it knocked the Beatles out of #1. And then come back, and we're going to talk about how Louis Armstrong dealt with some of these racial issues, and then we'll be done. Okay? So go listen to that and come back. Go. Okay, so this is our final discussion here. This is, we're going to touch on these sort of topics a couple of times throughout the class. The class is difference and diversity. I find it very important to just sort of discuss these things. So what you need to understand is the era that this was happening. If I can go back, 1964, we have just sort of passed the last big pieces of civil rights legislation. The schools had been desegregated and that kind of stuff. But 1955, they had not been. Right, 1947, they had not been yet. Okay, and I showed you that clip. Hopefully, you watched the entire film of A Rhapsody in Black and Blue, and you saw Louis Armstrong really sort of over the top, hamming it up and that kind of stuff, entertaining. Well, like I said, he was criticized by a lot of younger black jazz musicians as being what they would call an Uncle Tom, someone who would go out of their way to please the man. Younger musicians you will see, particularly like Miles Davis. When we start talking about Miles Davis in the 50s and 60s, Miles Davis, his approach was basically F you. If you don't like this, pound sand. That's not how Louis Armstrong operated. It's just not. And he grew up in a completely different world than Miles Davis did. So that's how those things, affect. That's how it affects those things. Okay. Anyway, Louis Armstrong knew sort of where his bread was buttered. He knew who his audience was, and he didn't necessarily dip into sensitive topics like race relations. But as these things were becoming so prominent in the country in the late 50s and the early 60s, even a good-natured guy like Louis Armstrong could chime in when needed and vent his frustration in a sense. He actually criticized the president at that time, President Dwight Eisenhower, for failing to desegregate the schools as quickly as they were supposed to. So the Brown versus Board of Education case, that was the Supreme Court of the United States. If you didn't know, that's what the SCOTUS acronym is. They ruled that in the late 50s, basically, mid to late 50s, that that the previous ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896, was no longer constitutional. Separate but equal was not constitutional, and they needed to desegregate the schools. Now, they didn't give any specific language like you must desegregate the schools by next Thursday, right? They didn't give a date. They said something about as soon as is expedient or something like that, right? So some governors took their time. Some took a lot of time. For example, some of the governors in southern states, like Governor Orville Faubus. He was the governor of Arkansas, and he refused to desegregate the schools. There was a school in downtown Arkansas known as Little Rock Central High School, and there was a group of students called the Little Rock Nine, and they wanted to get into that this school was closer for them, so they figured, maybe we should go there. In fact, let me show you. I could have done this before. Little Rock 9 photos. You may have seen some of these famous photographs here. These are the Little Rock 9 trying to get into school. Right there. Oops, sorry about that. Those students right there. That's a Little Rock 9. And there's a lot of famous pictures like this one, where this particular young lady is being shouted at by people who apparently don't want her to go to school there. There's the National Guard back there. Right, very vivid images, right? Well, Governor Orville Faubus actually called in the National Guard to keep, he said it was to, quote, maintain the peace and order of the community, which basically meant keep these 9 African-American students out of Little Rock Central High School. Okay, this obviously was national news. It was an opportunity for Governor Faubus to grandstand. I'm assuming most of you guys taking my class weren't around in 1957. You could really ask your grandparents if you have the opportunity, if they were around in 1957. If I were to speculate and say most of you are around 20 years old or so, and every generation is about, give or take, 30 years. So that means you guys were maybe born around the turn of the century, around the year 2000. Your parents might have been born around 1970, which is 30 years. And that means your grandparents, again, sort of the same thing, might have been born around 1940. So you may want to ask your grandparents. Maybe your grandparents are baby boomers and they were born right after World War II, 46, 47, 48. Even then, they probably would have vividly remembered this sort of stuff being on the news. And you should ask them about it. How did they feel about it at the time? What was their take on it? This kind of stuff. Do they remember living in a segregated society? Where they lived affected by this? Obviously, certain parts of the country, if there wasn't a large African American population, if your grandparents were on a rural, Wisconsin town, and they were sort of farmers, this may not have affected them at all, right? Anyway, This is when it was happening. In September 14th of 57, President Eisenhower met with Governor Faubus, but no steps were taken to ensure the children could enroll in school. 3 days later, Armstrong was in Fargo, North Dakota for a concert with his All-Stars. And there's a great story about how he was interviewed by a student reporter. He was a student at North Dakota State or the University of North Dakota, either UND or NDSU. It's really not that important. But he was also like moonlighting, writing small puff pieces for the Grand Forks Herald. He was assigned to go talk to Louis Armstrong in this hotel. He got there. His publisher explicitly told him not to talk politics, but the young man was a bit of a young rebel, and he ended up somehow he snuck in. He disguised himself. It's like a Hollywood story. He disguised himself as a waiter to bring Louis Armstrong his room service, because Louis Armstrong wouldn't take visitors before a concert or something like that. Anyway, he pleaded with him, said, I got to write this story for the newspaper. Can you help me out? Can you answer a few questions? So Louis Armstrong agreed to do it, and the gentleman eventually asked him about what he felt about the whole Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School thing, Governor Faubus, whatever. And Armstrong used that opportunity to be very clear. And he actually said that he called Eisenhower two-faced and said he had no guts. He actually called Governor Faubus a no-good motherfucker, which they had to change to uneducated plowboy when they printed it. When this young reporter, brought the story back to his publisher didn't believe him. He said, there's no way this is true, and we're not printing it. So they actually got up the next morning early, went back to the hotel, caught up with Louis Armstrong before he moved on to the next venue, and said, Mr. Armstrong, this is my publisher. Could you just confirm that everything you said here is true? And Armstrong said, print it. Every word of it is true. This obviously caused a big ripple effect. Armstrong, knowing very well, like I said, who his audience was, this could have been very damaging for Louis Armstrong in 1957 to speak out against a president, to speak out against the governor, to speak out so strongly against segregation and that kind of stuff. But he went out on a limb, took a risk. It actually didn't affect Louis Armstrong at all. But I wanted to show it to you in the context of he wasn't really just this Uncle Tom entertainer all the time. He was very much outspoken. There were, at this time in history, in the 50s as well, into the 60s, the United States used to have these goodwill ambassador tours where they would send jazz bands, because that was popular music. They would send jazz bands to other countries as examples of, look how great America is. And there were lots of jazz musicians that did this in the 50s. They asked Louis Armstrong to do it, and he said no, because his basic reasoning was, how can I go to Africa and say, look at how great America is when America is segregated, and I can't champion what we're doing now as great for African Americans. So he was very much outspoken when he needed to be, and I just find these stories to be really fascinating. So by all means, check out all the Louis Armstrong stuff. Listen to all those tunes. If you can, get with your grandparents. Ask them about Louis Armstrong. Ask them about Governor Faubus and Little Rock Central High School and all that sort of stuff. Go ahead and Google the Grand Forks Herald interview and stuff like that. It's really quite fascinating. That's all I have for you for this particular clip. Thanks a lot. There are some videos that I want you to watch that sort of coincide with Louis Armstrong, and they tell a good portion of his story as well. So make sure you get those done. Send me your answers to those daily assignments, to those film worksheets. And otherwise, that's all I got for you right now. Okay, you guys have a lovely afternoon or evening or whenever it is you're doing this. And send me any questions that you might have at any time. Otherwise, until next time, bye-bye.